You're listening to Psych with Mike. For more episodes or to connect with the show with comments, ideas, or to be a guest, go to www.psychwithmike.com. Follow the show on Twitter @PsychWithMike or like the Facebook page @PsychWithMike. Now, here's Psych with Mike.
I got so much about that I could say.
I knew you were going to do that.
You knew it, but you're too smart for me. All right, welcome into the Psych with Mike Library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan. I'm here with Mr. Brett Newcomb.
I knew you were going to do that.
You knew it.
I did.
Yeah.
Because I'm hypervigilant, you know.
Well, so I know that... well, actually, I don't know this, so I'll ask the question. I get the feeling that you don't always think the light banter in the intro is...
Light banter?
Yeah. Is good. Or
what an engaging concept.
But yet, when people write us, they identify that as actually something that they enjoy. So if you're listening and you don't enjoy that...
Don't tell us.
Well, or I was going to say, you need to let me know, because the feedback I've gotten is that people do enjoy that.
I'm happy.
Okay.
That's all I can tell you.
So this is listener request day.
Okay.
And everything that we're doing in this recording session is a listener request. And this is another suggestion from our good Australian friend Sarah, who had asked...
Who's the only listener that we have.
Yeah. Well, you would think that.
Yeah.
Although we do have other listener requests that we will be doing. So, but this is actually a concept or a phenomenon that is actually really dear to my heart, because I've actually done a fair amount of research on this area. But the idea of hypervigilance.
Yeah. I think. So, come back to the question of why do we do these podcasts? What is our raison d'etre?
I thought it was because we were really conceited.
Among the reasons
okay, there you go.
Do this podcast are several. My reason for doing this is you're my friend and you asked me to do it, and I said I'd be happy to try. But we were going to approach it from the standpoint of talking to clinicians, or talking to people in school to become clinicians. What are the things that you need to know? How does therapy work in the session? What's the underlying or background information that you need to have? What are the skill sets that you need to develop? How do you understand what's going on? What are you trying to do? The other reason is that a number of just general listeners like to listen because they acquire information that touches a nerve, or that stimulates a thought process or an exploration of a topic in their own lives. So we get 2 for 1. We get the response from people that listened and said that had meaningfulness for me, and we get response from listeners that say, clinically you're full of crap, or clinically I agree with you, or now I see this differently, or what have you. So when we talk about hypervigilance, I don't think you can do therapy as a clinician at any level. If you're working in a hospital, if you're working at a clinic, if you run a private practice, whatever, without running into clients that suffer from PTSD and generalized anxiety disorder.
And especially now, the more that the isolation mandates, the what do you call it, from the pandemic, when you have to stay at home.
Yeah, social distancing.
Yeah, but we had to stay at home, quarantine. As more and more of the quarantine restrictions get lifted, not just in the United States, but around the world.
I've spent too much time with myself, now I'm crazy.
Yeah. Well, but there's a lot of people who are going to come out of this either suffering from PTSD or could be working in that direction, and hypervigilance is going to be an aspect of this. So if you had known anybody during the pandemic that was, said, oh, if one mask is good, 3 masks is better, who, were very, very adamant that, you have to take your clothes off, wash them, and take a shower before you can interact with people once you've come in from outside. Those are things that qualify as being hypervigilant. So people have become very hypervigilant as a result of the pandemic. That's going to exacerbate what we see in hypervigilance in our clients.
Yeah, they have a perceived threat.
Yeah. And
so they're vigilant for evidence of the existence of that threat, that reality. They're trying to find it and make sure that they're safe from it.
And so what happens is hypervigilance is the result of epinephrine in the system, which is also known as adrenaline. So your body, through the sympathetic nervous system, says there's a threat here. You perceive it, whether it's real or not. Is if your body tells you, or if your brain tells you that there's a threat, your body goes into this threat mode, fight or flight mode, automatically. You don't think about it. You're not consciously aware that you are hypervigilant. But when you exist in that space for a long period of time, your body is dumping adrenaline until eventually your adrenal gland doesn't have any more adrenaline. That's called adrenal fatigue.
Right.
And if anybody has ever been diagnosed with adrenal fatigue, you know how debilitating that is.
Exhausted and debilitated, absolutely.
Yeah. And so hypervigilance has not only real psychological ramifications, but it has real physiological ramifications.
Absolutely. You reset your baseline. Mm-hmm. We all have a baseline of awareness. Our brains are functioning like a motor humming in the background. Mm-hmm. And it's set at a certain number of RPMs. And so we just hum along.
That's a great analogy. I'm going to start using that.
I'm a professional.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So something happens that startles us, a loud noise, a thunder crack, a car crash, a gunshot, what have you. And our systems are wired so that we get a surge. The adrenaline pops in and brings us to acute awareness so that we can respond and increase the chances of survival. But our system floods with a whole lot of chemicals.
Right. But adrenaline. Going back to the motor analogy, the motor now has shot up to redline.
Yeah.
And, there's a reason why they call that redlining if you are driving a car, because if you run your motor, it'll blow up. Yeah. And the same thing's true for the human body.
You can have a heart attack, you can have a stroke, you can have Addison's disease, you can have all kinds of physiological problems. You can have tumors on your adrenals, have to have one of them or both of them removed, and then be on drugs to provide what they provide for the rest of your life. It's a very serious physiological outcome that's a potential. And so as a clinician, when you get somebody in that's hypervigilant, one good recommendation, and it's a recommendation we don't make often enough. We do in our training programs, but then beyond that, I think people get away from remembering it. And that is, when you get a client that comes in that you don't know, who's complaining with some of these symptoms, send them to a physician for a complete checkup to see if there's a physiological problem driving the bus. And then if you get the reassurance that there doesn't appear to be, or that hadn't yet manifested, then you can approach driving the bus from a therapeutic perspective. But I got to know, first of all, do you have an adrenal tumor? Are you suffering from adrenal fatigue? Is this something that a physician can resolve more appropriately than I? Or tangentially with me? Yeah. Can we work together?
Because there is a psychological component.
Yeah.
And so it would be better together. Now, one of the things that I will tell people is that this concept of adrenal fatigue, even though it goes back to the 1950s in I'm blanking on the guy's name, Selly, who first talked about this hyper-vigilant kind of concept. He talked about the stress response. So back when he was doing his original work, tracking what the stress response is in human beings, that's what they called it. And so what we now call hypervigilance is that same stress response reaction that they talked about back in the day. And one of the things that is true is that medical science is not completely on board with the concept of adrenal fatigue or in adrenal overdrive. And so if you go to a physician who isn't, it's just like the testosterone issue that you worked with Kathy Maupin for all those years, that the medical community isn't in as great of an agreement about that as we need. So it will happen because it's clearly a real biological thing, but you have to have doctors who are trained to recognize it as legitimate. And while that's happening now, it's going to take a while for more and more physicians to get on board with it.
Yeah,
so
it's happening more and more.
Yeah. So if you go to a doctor and say, "Hey, I want to talk about, am I in adrenal overdrive? Am I suffering from adrenal fatigue?" and that person says, "Oh, there's no such thing," go to somebody else. There are other physicians out there that are receptive to that. Just because the first person that you go and talk to isn't receptive to it doesn't mean it's not a real thing.
It's so hard for an ordinary person to have a clue about how to approach that. Mm-hmm. There is no general agreement in medicine around most things. Right. I mean, they've just, in the last 7 years, started to discover that women experience heart attacks differently than men. Mm-hmm. Why didn't they know that? They said women were men, but without a penis. Mm-hmm. And so whatever we do for men, however men experience something, that must be the way that women do it. And for years, the FDA wouldn't allow women to be included in drug testing protocols. So everything was tested on men, measured for men, prescribed for men, and given to women, who then had overreactions to it. And it's like, well, women are weird. Mm-hmm. But there's not medical agreement about that. Right. Or anything else. Right.
Which is amazing that these learned individuals, people who are prescribing pharmaceuticals and making pharmaceuticals,
some of them believe in the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine.
Yes, absolutely. But the reality is
I like to say that word.
I know that women have a different hormonal makeup, and that can't be separated from your physiological responsiveness. Obviously, if you have different hormones in your body, you're going to experience physiological changes differently. I mean, it's amazing to me that wasn't something that was taken into consideration. But you're right, it wasn't.
Should be obvious. The same thing as treating the elderly. Yeah. Old people get the same medical doses that they got when they were young. Right. And so one of the biggest problems in treating the geriatric population is how do you balance all the medicines to be appropriate for their weight, their size, their energy level, their health issues. Right. Generally, you'll hear doctors talk about cutting their doses in half. Mm-hmm.
Right. Because their livers don't function the same way.
Their whole system doesn't function the same way.
So when we think about hypervigilance, in what ways do you experience that tells you, oh, this person I think is experiencing some hypervigilance?
Okay, if I watch them physically, I look for a startle effect. Mm-hmm. I look for agitation, constant motion, a leg tapping and step, and constantly pounding and jerking and twitching that they're unaware of. Mm-hmm. They don't even know they're doing it. Right. Constantly scanning a room.
That's the thing that to me is a dead giveaway. And I oftentimes tell people that if you've ever watched a bird, right, and the bird's head is just darting back and forth all the time.
Or a rabbit.
Yeah. That's what...
Because there are a lot of predators out there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, but that's what the response is that you overestimate the threat of just being alive, and so you're always on guard for where is the perceived danger coming from.
Absolutely.
I look for clenching the jaw muscles.
Yeah,
People
there'll be a muscle that pops in the cheek or the forehead. Those are good indicators. They're not absolute.
They're not absolutes.
That's the problem with nonverbals. Nonverbals are never specifically reducible. A generalized nonverbal concept, my jaw's popping, is not reducible to an accurate interpretation for an individual. You have to have other information.
No, but one of the things,
assumption.
One of the things though that I think is helpful for us is whether we're talking to clinicians or we're talking to lay people. We talk about nonverbal behavior, and that we are very, very adept at interpreting nonverbal behavior, both because we're very empathic, but we've also been educated to do that, and we have a lot of experience doing that.
Right.
And I want people to understand that's not magic. We're not magicians.
That's also potentially wrong.
Well, but
you got to be open to that possibility. I'll make this assumption if I don't know you and you come in and I'm making assumptions about what am I looking at here. Then I have to qualify them. I have to check them out.
Right.
I see that this keeps twitching every time we mention your mother. Your eye twitches.
Right.
Are you aware of that? Is that something you has pointed out before? And typically they'll say, no, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not happening. So you say, okay. You don't argue. You say, okay. Is it okay with you if whenever I think I see it, I point it out and ask, is it happening now? Is it happening now? Because what will happen is they will start to notice it. And then they will eventually say to you, did you catch that? I just did that.
So let's take a break and we'll pick this up on the other side. Hey, Brett.
Yes.
What's your favorite thing about Psych with Mike?
The opportunity to engage in mental gymnastics with you.
Wow, that is really powerful. So,
it's fun.
Do you think that that's beneficial for other people?
I have no clue. I would hope so, but I have no clue.
So people should write us and let us know.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
That would be great.
Especially if they agree with me.
As always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike. Okay, we're back. So, have you ever had somebody get angry because you identified a nonverbal that they were unaware of?
Angry might be too strong a term. Frustrated.
Okay.
I remember there was a young teenage girl that I was working with who she just carried so much distress in her body, and she couldn't sit still. She was fidgeting all over the couch, and it wasn't comfortable. She got up and started pacing. So rather than tell her she couldn't do that, I mean, and years and years ago, in therapy circles, they used to be into, like, there were debates, like when you could smoke in your office. If you had a client that smoked, was smoking a resistance, an avoidance behavior? Was it a signal to change to the body or to you, the topic of conversation? And should you as a therapist say, oh, you can't smoke whenever you're feeling these things? You can't use that avenue of relief. And take as a power-based kind of thing. So I remember being trained that this client was pacing. Don't force her to sit still, but don't disengage. Don't go do your paperwork or something while she paces. Get up and pace with her. And so the two of us are walking back and forth across my room, and I'm taking every step. And she's saying, I'm not saying anything. I'm just walking with her, not making fun of her, not sending any nonverbals of distress with her for this. I'm sending compassion and empathy. I'm attending to her. I'm walking step by step with her. We made 2 or 3 circuits of the room, and she stops against the wall and she starts banging her head against the wall. Then I stopped her. I said, you can't hurt yourself. You can't hurt the room. You can't hurt me. But I understand that you hurt. Can you tell me what you're feeling? Can you talk about it? Can you put words to this all? If you can't, that's okay. I will just stand here next to you and help you be safe while you feel it. So we made progress after that, but it took it took the right approach, not a confrontational, not a commanding, not authoritarian, and not interpretive. just had to say, I see that you are in pain that you can't contain in your body, and I will sit here with you while you feel it. And that's absolutely safe. Feel it.
Yeah.
Feel it. We'll take care of you here. You won't get hurt here. And then when you're able to, we can talk about it.
And so you getting up and walking with her is what's called mirroring. So you were mirroring her behavior. And do you think that made her more aware of the behavior?
Initially it made her accelerate.
Yeah.
But when she started hitting her head against the wall, and I said, you have to stop, you can't hurt yourself. We are about making sure that you don't get hurt, but you can feel what you're feeling, and I will stand here with you. I won't take it away from you.
Right.
I won't stop you. I want you to feel it, but I want you to know that I'm here and you're safe. So then she made progress.
Yeah, right. So in the case of hypervigilance, we took our break, didn't we?
Yes.
Okay. I can't even remember.
You should have been vigilant.
I know. There's this idea that everything is a threat, and whenever you see even the slightest provocation that there could be a threat, there's an overestimation of that. There's an avoidance to then perceive that threat, and so then what's happening is that these individuals may start to engage in what starts to look like and can actually become obsessive compulsive behaviors to try and guard against this incoming threat.
Yeah, it's a kind of magical thinking.
Yeah.
If I comb my hair just right, bad things won't happen. If I don't comb it just right, bad things will happen. Counters. I have to touch every wall in the room twice in the perfect order before I can go through the door and be safe.
Right.
And if something interrupts that, I have to start over. So you get people that are trapped in their room all day, they can't come out because they never can complete the circuit without an interruption.
Right. And so this comes up in therapy, or at least I've experienced this, that someone will be in therapy either with a significant other or not, but they'll be talking about the behaviors that one person requires the other one to do as a part of that OCD kind of presentation. And so then, I'll ask you this. My sense is that you can tell somebody you don't have to play that game if you don't want to. You can set a boundary. Do you feel like that is an accurate and appropriate response, or do you think that the other person should try and accommodate the individual who's requesting these behaviors?
Well, there's not a short answer to that. It depends on my understanding of the relationship, my knowledge of the people and the issues. I would hesitate to say that on either end of the spectrum, do it or don't do it, until I know more. If I felt safe enough in my understanding, I might suggest it as an experiment. Could we try not doing it 2 days a week and see what the outcome is, see how that impacts the person or the relationship.
Right.
But I would take a hesitant experiential approach as opposed to an authoritarian commanding approach, always.
And what I would tell people is, if you decide to engage in different behavior, you will be throwing that partner out of homeostasis.
Right.
And that's going to increase their anxiety, not decrease it.
It may escalate their loudness, their hysteria, their distress, their tears. You don't love me, accusations. Which is why you have to know them well enough to help frame an understanding of what may be happening and how to best respond to it.
Right. And so then, I would ask that person who is saying this other individual is requiring these behaviors of me, well, in what way is that causing you distress? If it's not causing you distress, can you accommodate it?
Right.
If the answer is no, then we have to talk about how you can set a boundary knowing that that's going to cause that other person increased anxiety.
Right.
But do you think there is ever a time...
At which point you may need to separate the therapy, because they're each going to be working on different issues.
Yeah. I mean, if the other person will go to therapy, sure.
Yeah.
Do you think there's ever a time when you would say, okay, hypervigilance is warranted?
Of course.
Yeah.
if there's a real threat.
And that's why I wanted to bring it up, is that we're not trying to say that no one should ever be hypervigilant.
No.
We want people to understand there's real psychological and physiological.
Yeah. If the police call, if an announcement goes out saying there are armed convicts in the neighborhood knocking on doors, don't answer your door. Be hypervigilant.
Right.
Figure out where your kids are. Know who's in the house. Go to a safe room. Whatever you need to do. But that's realistic because there's a real threat that you've been made aware of. And if you just wake up in the middle of the night and you have a panic, and I've had clients that do this more because they're having a flashback. They're having a memory of something that happened that was real, and their bodies get adrenalized and they wake up. So you have to learn how to reality test.
And for me, with the way that this plays out, what I always think of is when we were in the group practice and we did care teams in schools. And for people who don't know, those are student assistance programs that are mandated by the state of Missouri and mandated in other states as well. I used to go into the public schools. So there was only a handful of us that could go into the public schools. Anybody could go into the parochial or the county schools.
Right.
But to go down in the city, there was only a few of us that did that, and I would go into those public school systems, and the overwhelming time that we would spend in the care team would be talking about a select few individual students that they had identified as having an ED, which is an emotional disability, and inevitably what that would come down to is you had some individuals, because of their life circumstances, they were hypervigilant and they couldn't sit still in class. They were behavior problems. They would do things to try and allow themselves to feel safer that was not conducive to the educational environment. And the school's solution is, let's stop that individual from being hypervigilant. And I would say to them, I don't think that's what you want to do, because that could be a survival skill in this child's life. And I don't think that it is that you want to try and train them to not be hypervigilant. I think what you want to do is to help them understand school may be the only safe, stable environment that they exist in.
And help the school understand how to help the child.
Yeah. But don't consequence him for being hypervigilant.
Don't punish him.
Right.
Exactly. The schools may have dual responsibilities here. I've got a classroom full of 30 kids. I've got one kid that can't sit still.
Right. I get that.
Constantly tapping a pencil, constantly making noise, moving, jumping his leg up and down, shivering the whole desk and the whole room. I may need to teach that individual it's okay when this floods you to get up and pace back and forth quietly in the back of the room. And we'll continue our lesson, and the other kids can continue to learn. We don't have to spend 10 minutes engaged in an argument and a fight and a power issue control between the teacher and the student. Both of them can learn accommodative skills that allow this not to be so disruptive. And then I can even send a third student to get the counselor to come and pull the kid out of the classroom and talk them down off the ledge, if that's doable, if that's an appropriate response. But sometimes it's just really appropriate to say, you don't have to sit still in a chair. And especially when we're dealing with boys at younger ages, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, they haven't matured in the same way that girls have. They don't have the same control over their anxieties and their physiology. And so they may need more physical release, whether it's touching or tapping or, things to do. And you can create safety carols, like a study carol. And teachers used to use them as punishment. You go sit in the corner. You go face away from the rest of the class. You're a bad person. But instead you teach everybody, Joey needs a self-timeout to process or get himself calmed down or work through whatever this is. Then he can come back when he's ready. And the teacher can help facilitate that. We use the red green, yellow cards, and your kid's starting to escalate in what they're doing, and you hold up a yellow card. And the kid gets to the point that you can't stand or it's disruptive to other kids. You hold up the red card. You don't have to call him out by name. You don't have to stop the class and interrupt the procedure. You say, If I show you the red card, you go to the study carrel for a few minutes and calm down. You don't even set a time frame. It doesn't have to be like 10 minutes or 20 until recess.
Right. And the idea there is to encourage and empower the individual to be able to self-soothe, because when they learn that, they'll be able to do that for themselves.
But it's a systemic intervention, because you're not just dealing with that individual. You're dealing with a classroom full of other kids and a teacher and administrators. So it's a whole different complex issue.
And one of the things that I really try and emphasize with people is, if you are experiencing hypervigilance, that's actually a structural change in your brain. So there may actually be new pathways that have wired themselves in your brain that make it really, really hard for you to just confront the hypervigilance and say, I want to get a handle on this. It's a bigger process than just saying, I want to stop tapping my foot.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if it's a PTSD-related issue.
Right.
There was some significant childhood trauma experience. It rewired your brain.
Right.
So now we have to try to change that.
And so if you had that, where you've internalized some insecurity when you were a child, and now you've lived through a pandemic, that could trigger that response that wasn't causing you an issue before the pandemic started, but now is. And so if you want to address that, you have to understand that's going to be a long process that is going to need for you to be able to be insightful enough to challenge some of that automatic thinking that might be triggered whenever you get triggered from a threat. And that's something that you probably are going to need help with.
As a society, as educators, as therapists, we need to expect, especially in certain communities, an increase in these behaviors.
Absolutely.
If you live in a high-rise apartment building, 1 or 2 bedroom apartment with 3 kids under the age of 10 in your apartment, and they've been trapped in there for a year, not able to socialize, go out to school, go out to the playground.
I can't even imagine.
And then you have the adults who have their own issues about going to work and or working from home, and everybody in the house is on a computer trying to work from home in a 200 square foot apartment. That's going to lead to issues.
Absolutely.
Once we all get back in the classroom.
And one of the things that I am just incredibly aware of is that the pandemic has caused me the most minimal amount of inconveniences that I think have been experienced by anybody else in our country. It didn't stop me from working. It didn't stop me from I didn't go to restaurants, and I wear a mask when I go outside. But other than that, my life was relatively unchanged as a result of the pandemic. And I try and project myself into the reality of somebody living in a 15-story building in New York City in that 200 square foot apartment with maybe a child or 2, and what that life is like. And because their reality was that it was much more pervasive, it was much more deadly, their experience of the pandemic is just completely worlds apart from mine. And we need to all understand, just because we have a certain experience of the pandemic doesn't mean that that's everybody's experience.
Well, yes, absolutely, and that's true in so many situations, topics that you want to identify. Just because it happened to you doesn't mean it's happened to everybody.
Right.
Or that they experienced it in the same way that you did.
Exactly. And so I want to be sympathetic and empathetic to those individuals who had a much more severe experience of the pandemic than I have had. And as we start to come out of the pandemic and more people are getting vaccinated, I'm really, really trying to be aware of when I see people in these hypervigilant states, and to encourage them to become aware of that themselves. Because even if I point this out to you, I say, hey, Brett, I think you're being, that you're experiencing some anxiety. If you don't learn how to self-soothe that, then you don't know. And so the goal is for me to help you to recognize it in a way that allows you to employ self-soothing techniques. And so I don't know if you've ever done this. One of the things that I like to do with people is to ask them, what is the earliest memory of comfort that they can identify.
I've never done that.
Yeah. And then to talk about what that felt like, and to ask them, if I see them being hypervigilant, can they get in touch with that very first memory that they have of feeling comforted, and does that change how they feel now? And a lot of times people will say, yeah, it feels completely different. And I say, okay, that was the beginning of when you were learning how to self-soothe. And even if that got derailed later, that's what your body knows of self-soothing. And I would like for you to try and practice remaining in touch with that feeling.
So do you use EMDR? Do you use tapping? Do you use some sort of process?
I have not
physiologically addressed that as well as psychologically?
I am very aware that the way that I speak, the tone, the cadence is specifically designed not to be a hypnotic induction, but to be a pre-hypnotic induction, so that people, the hope is that the rate of my speech is encouraging a sympathetic reaction in their neural system, because their ears are vibrating with that same kind of frequency and their neurons are being coaxed in. It's like listening to whale song.
Well, but again, training therapists, one of the things that I would say is match breathing rhythms, and then change it. So if you've got a client that's hypervigilant or
that is a great point.
Highly aroused, you match your breathing to theirs, and then as you talk to them, you change your breathing rate and calm it down. Very, very often they'll follow you.
And the same thing is true with their speech. If people are getting loud, what I will do is actually get quieter. It's really hard for somebody to argue with you when you're whispering.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't argue with you because you were so quiet.
Well, all right. Hopefully that is beneficial for people. And as always, the music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue. You can get us, if you want to send us some requests, psychwithmike.com. You can get us on the Facebook at Psych with Mike, on Twitter at Psych with Mike, and on TikTok at Psych with Mike. And as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.